Snow was falling in heavy, endless waves across the Ardennes forest. The trees stood like frozen sentinels, their branches weighed down by the cold silence of war. It was December 1944, the deadliest winter of World War II. Allied soldiers huddled in their foxholes, believing the war was nearly over. But deep within that silence, something enormous was stirring. The German army, thought to be broken, was preparing a strike so bold, so unexpected, that it would shock the world. The Battle of the Bulge was about to begin. Among the thousands of young Americans scattered through those forests was a man named Thompson. He came from Wichita, Kansas, a flat land of wheat fields and windmills, far removed from the noise of artillery and the smell of diesel. Before the war, Thompson had worked as a mechanic. He was the kind of man who could listen to an engine and tell you which gear was failing, who could measure by instinct and calculate by feel. In the Army, those instincts found a new purpose. Thompson became a gunner in a tank destroyer unit, men trained to hunt steel with steel, to strike before being seen. By mid-December, Thompson's unit was positioned near a frozen road outside the small Belgian town of Bastogne. His vehicle, an M36 Jackson, crouched low under camouflage netting, its long gun barrel pointed toward a clearing in the forest. The air was thick with fear and anticipation. Radio chatter came and went, half words and static. The officers said to hold position. No one was to open fire without command authorization. Somewhere out there, the Germans were advancing, but no one knew when or from where. Inside the tank destroyer, the metal walls amplified every sound. The creak of boots on the frozen floor, the hiss of breath through thick scarves, the distant hum of engines that might belong to friend or foe. Thompson sat with his eyes fixed to the periscope. He had the calm of a man who understood that panic kills faster than bullets. Outside, the world was a gray blur of snow and smoke. Inside, his mind was working like a clock. He heard it before he saw it, the low guttural growl of diesel engines, synchronized and steady. German panzers, several of them. The sound came from the north, muffled by the snow but too deliberate to mistake. Thompson gripped the handles of the scope and turned slowly, adjusting focus through the haze. Then shapes emerged, dark silhouettes moving in formation, their turrets glinting faintly under the pale morning light. They were coming straight toward the American line. The radio crackled again, but this time only static. Command had gone silent. No orders. No coordinates, just the growing vibration of enemy armor rolling closer. Thompson's commander whispered through clenched teeth, "Hold your fire, wait for orders." But orders were a luxury the battlefield rarely allowed. Thompson's brain began to calculate. Distance, approximately 700 yards. Elevation, minimal. Wind, crossflow from the left, negligible. He traced the path of the lead tank, a Panther, its armor sloped and deadly, and imagined the ricochet angles on frozen ground. The snow, he realized, wasn't just cover, it was a mirror. A shell that struck low could skip, fragment, and hit from beneath, a move so unconventional that no training manual dared to recommend it. He breathed deeply, his heartbeat steadying into rhythm with the machine. He could see 3, maybe 4 tanks behind the lead. If he could take out the first, the rest would choke the road. But to make that happen, he'd have to fire without clearance. He'd have to disobey direct orders and trust his instincts against everything he'd ever been taught. Outside, the German engines grew louder, closer, their exhaust plumes cutting through the fog. Thompson whispered something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe a calculation. He adjusted the sight by 2 degrees, compensating for the expected recoil. His finger hovered over the trigger. For a moment, time stopped. The war disappeared. There was only geometry, angles, distance, steel, and silence. He fired. Smoke hung low across the trees, mixing with the frozen mist until sky and ground became one color, a pale, ashen gray. The forest echoed with the metallic groan of ruptured steel. Thompson's first shot had struck with surgical precision, piercing the lead panther just above the treads and detonating inside the ammunition rack. The explosion turned the tank into a furnace. Flames licked upward, melting snow and painting the branches in shifting shades of orange. For a few seconds, there was only silence, that eerie stillness that comes after something impossible has just happened. Then, the Germans began to shout. The rest of the column tried to reverse, but the narrow road was frozen solid, flanked by trees thick as pillars. In their confusion, one tank slammed into another. A truck veered off into a ditch, its wheels spinning uselessly in the snow. From his hidden position, Thompson could see it all through the faint ripples of smoke drifting past his scope. He reloaded without a word. The shell clanked into the breech, the metallic sound sharp and intimate inside the M36. He adjusted the elevation slightly lower, this time aiming not at the holes, but at the ground beneath them. He fired. The rounds struck a patch of hard ice, ricocheted upward, and punched through the side of the second tank at a perfect angle. It was a move that defied logic, one that no field manual ever dared to mention. But it worked. The explosion was muffled but lethal. The second tank's engine compartment burst open, and black smoke rose like a signal to the heavens. Inside the M36, Thompson's commander, Lieutenant Harris, could only stare. "Christ, Ray, what the hell are you doing?" Thompson didn't answer. His hands were steady, his eyes fixed. Every movement was methodical, almost mechanical. The hands of a man who saw battle not as chaos, but as geometry. He shifted the barrel 2 degrees to the left and fired again. Each shot came from the same gun, but Thompson varied the rhythm, never 2 shots alike, never predictable. To the Germans, it sounded as if they were surrounded by multiple American batteries firing from different angles. The forest itself seemed alive with thunder. Snow erupted from the ground with every hit, masking muzzle flashes and confusing direction. The German commander tried to organize a counterattack. 2 infantry squads dismounted and began to move forward through the trees. Thompson switched to high-explosive rounds and adjusted his sight downward. He aimed not directly at them,
but slightly ahead, using the blast radius to disorient rather than destroy. The first shell detonated in the snow, throwing white powder and frozen dirt into the air. The soldiers hit the ground, convinced they were being bracketed by heavy artillery. Some started shouting coordinates into their radios, but there was no reply. Their communications were jammed, their chain of command broken. Inside the American vehicle, Harris finally understood what Thompson was doing. He wasn't just firing at tanks, he was dismantling the enemy's sense of direction, their belief in control. Every detonation created confusion. Every silence afterward felt like the pause before another unseen strike. It was warfare as psychology, not firepower. After about 10 minutes, the road ahead looked like a graveyard of metal. 3 tanks destroyed, 2 immobilized, and the rest retreating into the fog. Thompson leaned back, exhausted, his hands blackened from gunpowder. The temperature inside the vehicle was freezing, yet sweat ran down his neck. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and indifferent, covering the wreckage of men and machines alike. Harris broke the silence. "You just violated direct orders," he said quietly. Thompson wiped his face with a glove. "Yes, sir." "Do you realize what that means?" Thompson nodded. "It means we're still alive." For a moment, Harris said nothing. Then slowly, he reached for the radio, trying to contact command. Static answered back. Broken voices, distorted words. Finally, through the noise came a faint transmission. Reports of German armor pulling back, of a small American unit that had somehow broken their advance. No one could explain it. Thompson sat still, listening. His mind wasn't on the praise or the disobedience. He was studying the sound of distant engines again. Something about the rhythm told him this wasn't over. The Germans would regroup. They always did. But for now, they had bought time. Precious hours for the 101st Airborne, trapped near Bastogne, to dig in and prepare for the siege that was coming. He climbed out of the M36 for the first time since dawn. The cold air hit him like a wall. All around, the forest glowed faintly from the still-burning wrecks. The sky was a dull silver, the color of exhaustion. He looked at what he had done, at the smoldering tanks, the broken trees, the frozen silence, and felt nothing triumphant, only necessity. War, he thought, was not about glory. It was about choices made in seconds that others would spend years trying to understand. Somewhere behind him, Harris called his name. Thompson turned, his face ghostly in the snowlight. "Orders are to hold position," Harris said. "Reinforcements are moving up." Thompson nodded. His hands trembled now, the adrenaline fading. He looked once more toward the forest where the enemy had vanished. "They'll come back," he said quietly, "and when they do, we'll be ready." The wind carried his words into the dark. The snow thickened, burying the tracks of battle, as if trying to erase what had happened. But beneath that silence, the echoes of Thompson's gunfire still lingered, a rhythm of defiance that had saved a division and perhaps changed the course of the fight for Bastogne. Far from Kansas, in a frozen corner of Europe, Ray Thompson had written his own chapter of the war, not with permission, but with instinct, and the forest, still burning in patches of faint orange, seemed to acknowledge it in silence.
By dawn the next morning, the forest was quiet again, too quiet for comfort. The snow had buried the tracks of retreating tanks, and the fires that once marked the battlefield had burned down to black ash. Only the twisted remains of metal poked through the frost, silent witnesses to the night before. The smell of fuel and cordite still hung in the air. Inside a makeshift command post several miles behind the line, officers argued over conflicting reports. Radio transmissions spoke of a lone American battery that had annihilated a German armored spearhead. Others said it was an airstrike. One claimed the Germans had turned on each other in the fog. No one mentioned a single tank destroyer, because no one believed it was possible. When Lieutenant Harris finally managed to get through to battalion headquarters, the disbelief was immediate. "You're telling me one M36 knocked out 5 Panzers," the voice on the other end demanded, "without orders, without support?" Harris hesitated. "Yes, sir, and if I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't believe it either." The line went silent for a moment. Then came the response, cold and official. "Return to base for debriefing, both of you." Thompson said nothing. He simply sat by the fire, his gloves off, his fingers trembling as he cleaned the gun's breech. His mind wasn't on the aftermath. He kept replaying every second of the engagement, every ricochet, every flash, every scream that had followed. He knew the numbers, the geometry, the science. What he couldn't measure was the weight now pressing on his chest. When they reached headquarters later that day, the camp was a chaos of maps, shouting officers, and incoming casualty reports. The Battle of the Bulge was raging on every front. Thompson's small victory had bought the Allies time, but the Germans were still advancing elsewhere. In the middle of it all, the 2 men from Kansas and Ohio, one quiet, one exhausted, were ushered into a cold tent where 3 officers waited behind a table. The debriefing was short, clinical, and strangely detached from reality. "Why did you open fire without clearance?" they asked. Thompson looked at the officer's pen scratching across the paper. "Because they were coming," he said simply. "Do you realize the risk? Your unit could have been mistaken for the enemy." He nodded. "But we weren't." "Did you understand that disobeying a direct order is grounds for court-martial?" "Yes, sir." "And yet you fired anyway?" "Yes, sir." The officers exchanged glances. One of them, an older colonel with tired eyes, leaned forward. "What made you so sure you'd hit them?" Thompson hesitated, searching for words. "I wasn't sure," he said quietly. "I just knew where they'd be before they did." There was another pause. The colonel closed his notebook slowly. "You may have saved a lot of lives yesterday, son, but don't ever let instinct outrun discipline." When they were dismissed, Harris tried to lighten the moment. "Well, at least they didn't shoot us." Thompson smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. He walked outside into the snow, where the light was soft and blue. Around him the camp buzzed with the sound of engines and orders. Men were moving, marching, shouting, the war rolling forward like a machine that could never stop. That night sleep didn't come easily. Thompson lay awake inside his tent, listening to the wind move through the trees. Every gust carried echoes, distant engines or maybe just memories of them. His mind drifted back to the battlefield, to the German voices shouting in panic, to the explosions he had caused. He remembered the sound of the last tank burning, and for the first time he wondered how many men had been inside. War teaches soldiers to stop counting, but some numbers refuse to be forgotten. At dawn he was up again, checking the barrel of the gun, wiping frost from the optics, readying for whatever came next.
The radio buzzed with updates. Bastogne was under siege, the 101st Airborne surrounded but holding. Reinforcements were being diverted there, including Thompson's unit. When Harris brought him the orders, Thompson simply nodded. "Back into it," Harris said, forcing a grin. "Guess they still trust us." Thompson looked down at his hands, still raw from the cold, the skin marked by burns from the recoil lever. "He trusts results," he murmured. Later that day, as their vehicle rumbled down the frozen road towards Bastogne, the forest passed by like a gray dream. Thompson sat in silence, his eyes distant. He could feel the weight of command's warning in the back of his mind, but deeper than that was something else, a quiet certainty that the war wasn't done testing him. The battle that had made him a hero in whispers might soon make him a ghost in reports. Behind him, Harris looked out at the wrecked German armor, half buried in snow. "You ever think about how close we came?" he asked. Thompson didn't answer. He was staring ahead, towards the horizon where smoke rose above Bastogne, where men were fighting to hold the line against impossible odds. "Close doesn't matter," he finally said. "Only the next shot does." The strode stretched on endlessly, lined with burned trees and frozen shadows. The war was changing shape now, less about territory, more about endurance. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered again, muffled by snow. Thompson listened carefully, as he always did, tracing the sound in his head like a map. He wasn't thinking about medals or recognition. He was thinking about survival, about angles, about the strange rhythm of war that only men like him could hear, a rhythm that demanded both obedience and rebellion. And as the convoy rolled towards the heart of the Ardennes, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. His decision to fire without orders was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning.
By the time Thompson's unit reached the outskirts of Bastogne, the snow had turned the roads into rivers of ice. Smoke hung in the air like a low ceiling, and the distant thunder of artillery rolled constantly across the sky. The 101st Airborne was surrounded, cut off, and fighting to hold the town against relentless German assaults. Every road into Bastogne was under fire. Every inch of ground had become a question of survival. When Thompson's M36 arrived, no one had time for formal greetings. The defenders were exhausted, half-starved, and running low on ammunition. Their faces were hollow, their eyes red from smoke and cold. Yet when word spread that a lone tank destroyer crew had wiped out a German column days earlier, something changed in the camp. Soldiers began whispering. "You hear about that Kansas gunner?" one said. "Took out a whole platoon by himself." The story had already grown, like stories always do in war. Some said he used secret shells, others claimed he'd been guided by air reconnaissance, but no one knew the truth, that it was all instinct, geometry, and nerve. Thompson didn't correct them. He didn't talk about it at all. He just kept his focus on the gun, cleaning, adjusting, calculating. Every morning before the fighting resumed, he checked the optics, measured the barrel's temperature, and memorized the terrain. His commander noticed how he stared at the hills as if tracing invisible lines between the trees, mapping out where a tank would appear before it even moved. In those cold days of siege, Thompson's method began to spread. Other gunners started to imitate his patterns, staggered firing intervals, deceptive echoes, ricochet shots off hard surfaces. They called it collapse targeting, the art of breaking the enemy's perception before breaking their machines. It wasn't in any manual. It was passed around like a secret between men who had seen too much to care about rules. Soon command took notice. Reports came in from other fronts where crews were using similar tactics with surprising success. Someone somewhere had written a brief memo describing the Thompson pattern.
It reached division headquarters, then corps. By the time it hit the desks in London, it had already become part of official rumor, an example of adaptive combat behavior. But while his name spread through channels, Thompson himself grew quieter. Each victory left him colder. The sound of each explosion echoed longer in his head. When he looked at destroyed enemy vehicles, he no longer felt triumph, only an emptiness that seemed to deepen with each fight. One night, during a lull in the shelling, Harris found him outside, sitting alone on a pile of ammunition crates. The stars were dim through the haze, and the air smelled of frozen oil. Harris handed him a tin cup of coffee. "You know they're talking about you in headquarters, right? You're practically a myth." Thompson didn't look up. "Myths don't have nightmares," he said quietly. Harris frowned. "You did what you had to do." "I did what no one told me to do. That's not the same thing." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint rumble of artillery in the distance. Then Harris said, "You think too much for a soldier." Thompson gave a dry laugh. "That's what my father said before I left home." The next day they went back into the fight. German armor had pushed close again, using the snow as cover. Thompson guided his crew into a new position, higher ground this time, overlooking a road lined with destroyed trucks. Through his scope, he saw the faint glint of movement, more Panthers, more targets. He didn't wait for orders. He just aimed, breathed, and fired. Each round struck with terrifying precision. But this time he noticed something. The enemy didn't react with panic. They maneuvered differently, slower, more careful. They had learned from him. They were adapting. Thompson realized with a chill that his pattern was no longer a secret. Someone on the other side had studied it, recognized the rhythm, and was trying to turn it against him. The duel that followed was unlike anything he had experienced. It wasn't brute force. It was chess, played in smoke and snow. He fired once, they fired twice, each side trying to deceive the other, to mislead the ear, to break the illusion of numbers. The forest became a web of sound and fire, each explosion echoing off the ice like thunder. When the smoke cleared, 3 German tanks burned quietly in the distance. Thompson's vehicle had taken a hit to the side, not a kill, but close. His hands were shaking as he reloaded, his breath visible in the cold air. Harris shouted something, but Thompson didn't hear it. All he could think of was how close they had come, how the enemy had adapted. That night he wrote a few lines in a small notebook he kept in his pocket, a habit from before the war. The words were brief, uneven, almost a whisper to himself. The line between instinct and madness gets thinner each day. In the following weeks, the siege broke. Allied reinforcements arrived. The Germans withdrew. Bastogne was saved. But for Thompson, there was no relief. He had fought his war inside a frozen forest of ghosts, where decisions were measured not in medals, but in moments. When the orders came to pull back for rest, he didn't celebrate. He simply stood by his machine one last time, hand resting on the cold steel of the barrel, eyes lost in the distance. Around him, soldiers cheered, laughed, embraced, but he remained still, as if part of him was still out there in the snow, trapped between the echoes of his own gunfire. Far behind the lines, in offices filled with maps and coffee cups, officers discussed how to formalize the Thompson method. They debated the angles, the intervals, the psychological theory behind collapse targeting. None of them ever met the man who invented it in the middle of a snowstorm. To them, he was a name, a file, a success story. To himself, he was just a mechanic from Kansas who had learned too well how to listen to war. And in the silence that followed Bastogne, he began to wonder whether that instinct, the same one that had saved so many lives, might one day destroy his own.
The morning fog clung to the Ardennes like a second skin, thick and pale, muting the distant rumble of engines and the occasional echo of gunfire. The world seemed suspended between life and death. In a small clearing, Ray Thompson wiped the condensation from his gun sight and squinted downrange. He could see the faint movement of German armor pushing through the mist, tigers, panthers, and half-tracks in a column formation. The 101st Airborne was dug in several miles behind his position, unaware that the German vanguard was moving faster than anticipated. Thompson knew the stakes. If those tanks broke through, Bastogne would fall. He listened to the radio for updates, but the line crackled with static. Command hadn't issued new firing orders. The artillery grid was still being recalibrated. Technically, he had no authority to engage. But Ray didn't care about technically. He watched the lead tank creep forward, its gun scanning for threats, and he noticed something. Its spacing was wrong. The German formation was too tight, their line too straight for forest terrain. They were confident, maybe overconfident. That was the mistake he had been waiting for. Ray adjusted his rangefinder, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, "One shot." He fired. The first round hit the lead tank's lower hull, not the turret, exactly where the armor was weakest. The explosion was sharp, controlled, contained. The second tank stopped immediately, confused, blocking the path behind it. Ray fired again, this time at the rear of the column. Within seconds, 2 plumes of smoke trapped the entire German line inside a narrow kill zone. The gunners panicked, trying to maneuver their vehicles, but the frozen mud turned their retreat into chaos. Ray began to change firing rhythm. 1 shot, pause, 2 quick shots, pause again. It wasn't random. It was deliberate disorientation. The Germans couldn't tell how many guns were firing, or from where. They believed they were under heavy artillery attack. Some abandoned their vehicles. Others began firing wildly into the forest. Ray kept his breathing calm, his focus absolute. Each round he placed was a message, each pause an illusion. He made one man's gun sound like an entire battery. Minutes passed like hours. His loader, Private Jenkins, was drenched in sweat, feeding shells into the breach as fast as his trembling hands allowed. "They'll court-martial us for this," Jenkins muttered. Ray didn't answer. He was already sighting his next target. A third tank erupted in flame. A half-track veered off the road, colliding with a frozen tree. The column collapsed, not from destruction, but confusion. When it was finally over, Ray stepped outside his destroyer, the cold air biting through his uniform. The field before him was silent, except for the crackling of burning metal. What had been an armored advance was now a graveyard of twisted steel. He had fired without permission, but his timing, his pattern, his control, it had saved the entire sector. In the distance, the faint sound of Allied rifles echoed, signaling that the 101st had held their position. Ray looked at the smoke curling into the winter sky and whispered, "We held the line." He didn't know it then, but his rogue engagement would become one of the most analyzed firing sequences in post-war military academies. Officers would call it collapse targeting, the art of using psychology and timing to make a single weapon sound like many. But in that moment, Ray Thompson wasn't thinking about strategy or history. He was thinking about the men behind him, the ones counting on him to do something, anything, before it was too late.